One of the things my son told me that was really frightening is he started out as a drone operator for this unit. And he said that as soon as he turned his drone on, the Russians knew where he was and would pound the area with artillery. And the artillery shells kill everything within a football field, within 100 meters. And so it's a different kind of war than we've probably, I mean, we're used to fighting wars where we're dropping bombs in the desert and or doing drone strikes against with no anti-aircraft artillery and nobody and total domination of the skies. But the Russians actually have really good assets and they have very good trained pilots and they have a devastating artillery system.
No, look, this is a war. We used to train for this kind of war. When I was in the Marine Corps back in the 1980s, we trained for large scale ground combat in a European environment. That was back when we had 300,000 troops on the ground in West Germany, and we could fly in another 250,000 troops in 10 days. And, we were planning to go to war against a Soviet group of forces in Germany that were 400, 500,000 strong. But after the Cold War ended, we stopped preparing for this kind of fight. The Gulf War, we won because we brought the best military in the world to bear on the problem. We fought the world's fourth largest army. So anybody who thinks the Iraqis were not capable of fighting, you don't know the Iraqis. They fought very, very hard. But you can't stand up against an opponent like the United States Army and the United States military in the early 1990s. We had prepared for decades to fight a Soviet army that could bring to bear a lot of violence. But then we entered the global war on terror. And as you said, we're fighting an enemy that was tenacious, but not capable of dealing death like the Russians and the Ukrainians could do right now. We haven't fought a campaign against an integrated air defense system since Desert Storm. I mean, there was a little bit of that against Serbia in 1999, but what the Russians have in terms of air defense is mind-boggling. And anybody who thinks that American or NATO air power would turn this around, you don't know what you're talking about. Talk to the Ukrainian pilots right now. The Russians have brought in their fourth generation fighter, the Su-35, and their radar and long-range missile capability makes it impossible for the Ukrainian Air Force to take off because they're shot down as soon as they get up in the air. That would be the fate of much of NATO's air power if they tried to engage the Russians. Again, the level of violence, as you said, that what's happening here is electronic warfare. See, when your son turned on his drone, it emits a signal. That signal is picked up immediately by Russian electronic warfare, who then triangulate the signal and put artillery down on that target. And so what drone operators have to do is offset their position with an antenna that's set, a couple kilometers away so that when the signal's detected, the artillery shells land over there. But that trick, remember, the Russians aren't stupid. They'll do that trick once, and then the Russians will start to search for the signals. You cut that signal, go. This is a level of sophistication. We talk about the violence that's taking place, but the sophistication of warfare right now is again, beyond the imagination of people. Electronic warfare, communications intercept. If you make a mistake, in short, you die. This war is not forgiving for people who make mistakes on either side. The Russians have made several mistakes. They die. The Ukrainians have made many mistakes. They die. I am very happy your son came home safely, but I think he understands that there before the grace of God goes him in terms of the number of people who did lose their lives. War is an unforgiving business. And this war in particular, because no one has imagined this conflict. We haven't had a situation where this many people die this quickly in armed conflict in a long, long time.
I mean, one of the frightening things about this war is, and I think the Polish foreign minister mentioned this the other day, that the plan is if the Ukraine collapses, NATO will then go in. That's, I think, a very, very frightening thought that we then would get a full out war between NATO and the Soviet Union. And that means the US Soviet Union war, because we're paying for 90% of this war. You talked about the competency of the Soviet or the Russian pilots and the quality of their aircraft. How would they stand up against American aircraft and fighters?
Back in the day, giving away my age here, we used to run, an exercise in Nellis Air Force Base called Red Flag. And Red Flag was a force-on-force, U.S. versus Soviet, realistic dogfights. But we haven't done that in a long time. We now have resumed it, but we bring a lot of bias into our planning. And so whenever you hear somebody say that we are planning against a near peer opponent, That means they're planning against somebody that is designed to be inferior to the Americans. So a lot of operational assumptions are made based upon certain aspects of superiority that are automatically given to the American side in this war game. That's just not the case. The Su-35 fighter is one of the finest fighters in the world. It's a fourth generation fighter that is easily the equivalent of the F-22 fighter. The Russians have a different way of waging air combat. I'm not saying it's better than ours. I'm saying it's different. It's one you definitely have to train against. The Russians are operating within the framework of an integrated air defense system that is lethal to any mistakes. We haven't trained on this. And anybody who has been in combat will tell you that unless you train as you're going to fight, the first time you go into combat, you're going to be making a lot of mistakes that should have been made in training. But if we're not training properly, that means the mistakes are going to be made on the front line. The Russians have had a year now to go up against a NATO-style military. They made a lot of mistakes up front. They've learned, they've adapted. I'm not going to sit here and say that it wouldn't be a fight. I have too much respect for American professionalism, American pilots, and the American combat team. But I will say that throughout history, if you study the initial combat of American forces in wars, we tend to fight the last war. This war is, again, as General Kabuli said, is beyond the imagination. If we're fighting the last war, that means we're fighting the wars in Iraq, the wars in Afghanistan, the wars in Syria. We're not ready for what's about to happen. That doesn't mean we can't learn, but that learning curve is going to come at a horrific cost. And here's the other problem then is sustainability. How many casualties can the United States take? We have 100,000 troops right now in Europe. Not all of those are combat troops. We'll call maybe 40, 50,000 of them combat troops. What happens when they start taking casualties? Who's going to replace those casualties? And I'm not talking about individual replacements. I'm talking about unit replacements. When a battalion takes 60% losses in a day and a half, which is going to happen, who replaces that battalion? We don't have any left to give them. Where are we going to get them? How are we going to get them there? This is, again, a level of war that people don't understand. If we don't have it on the ground, it's not going to arrive. If we're talking about going to war against Russia, understand not a single ship will land in Hamburg intact. They will be sunk if we're at war with Russia. But here's the good news, sir. With all due respect to the Polish foreign minister, how does he think he's going to get Polish troops into Western Ukraine? Under what authority? NATO has two methods of authorizing conflict. One is, of course, Article 5. An attack against one is an attack against all. If Russia doesn't attack Poland, where's the justification? And Russia has no intention of attacking Poland. So now Article 4 comes in. That's how NATO goes to war. If you take a look at the conflict in Libya, you take a look at Afghanistan even. These are all Article 4 fights. The fight against Serbia, Article 4. That is where NATO comes together and determines that a security threat exists that warrants NATO intervention. But it requires the unanimous consent of NATO. And Poland is not going to get the unanimous consent of NATO for a military adventure into Western Ukraine that could lead to World War III. So Poland would have to go in alone. And if there's an army in Europe that's not prepared for large-scale ground combat in Europe against a Russian-style enemy, it's Poland. Their army is small. They're talking about doubling up to 300,000, but they're not there yet. It's poorly equipped, and whatever equipment they have, they've given to the Ukrainians. They haven't replaced this equipment. They're not well trained. So there's zero chance that they would be able to enact the policies that their politicians are giving word to. What Poland's hoping is that they can drag NATO in there with them, but there's no appetite in NATO right now for a conflict with Russia, none whatsoever.
You know, you mentioned earlier on that Russia didn't really want to take Kiev, that it doesn't want to take all of Ukraine. What does, in your view, what does Vladimir Putin want? What did he want when he went in there? And what's his objective now?
Well, we have a good idea of what he did want when he went in there. That's the peace treaty that was negotiated. It seems to me that the Russians put on the table what their demands were, and what they got in that peace treaty, what they wanted was recognition that Crimea is Russia forever. That's it. Belongs to Russia. Ukraine has to concede that. They were seeking at the time the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk, the two Donbass republics. And from the Russian perspective, after 8 years of the citizens of Donbass being treated as terrorists by the government in Kiev, bombarded on a daily basis, there could be nothing less. You can't ask Lugansk and Donetsk, the primary majority ethnic Russian populations, to return under the wing of Ukraine. They wanted Ukraine to commit that they would never join NATO. That's been a Russian demand since 2008, when William Burns, current CIA director, then U.S. ambassador to Russia, wrote a memorandum called Net Means Net, where he outlined the Russian position. They will not tolerate Ukraine becoming part of NATO. We knew that in 2008. Russia insists that that's a condition today. Demilitarization. They did not want NATO infrastructure in Ukraine. They didn't want Ukraine to become a de facto extension of NATO as it had after being trained by NATO from 2008 to 2022. So that's what the Russians wanted. And you know what? If the Ukrainians had taken that deal, it would have been a good deal compared to what they have today. Now Russia has taken Kherson, Zaporizhia, Lugansk, and Donetsk. All four of those territories are now, from the Russian perspective, part of Russia. And with all due respect, that's the only perspective that counts, because they have a constitution that they believe in, just like we believe in ours. And that constitution has been adapted to recognize these territories as Russia. They will never get them. Ukraine will never get them back. And the reason why I say that is because now that it's part of Russia, it's protected by the totality of Russia's military capability, which includes nuclear weapons. So if there's any dream on the part of NATO that through the use of military force, they can recapture these territories, that's like the Russians coming into Mexico and telling the Mexicans they can take back Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico. The United States would view that as an existential threat, and we would use every means necessary, including nuclear weapons, to prevent that from happening. So that's where we're at. What Russia has said is what they're looking for now is the social and economic revitalization of these new Russian territories, that they have no desire to acquire additional territory, but they still require demilitarization. That means NATO infrastructure is removed. It also means that Ukraine's army will now have to pull back 150 kilometers from the new Russian border, because Russia will never again tolerate a situation where Ukraine is firing artillery shells against Russian civilian targets, which Ukraine does on a daily basis, killing 2 to 3, sometimes more Ukrainian civilians a day in Donetsk and other areas. And then the no NATO. And the last one is going to be a more difficult one. I don't know how Russia is going to pull it off, but they insist they're going to be able to do this. And this is denazification. That means to get rid of the far-right ultra-nationalistic parties that have taken over the government in Ukraine, to delegitimize, deplatform the ideology of Stepan Bandera, an odious historical character who fought alongside Adolf Hitler as the blood of tens of thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Poles and Russians on his hands. He is the national hero of Ukraine today, and Bandera is, from an ideological perspective, he's in the DNA of the Zelensky government. And so the Russians have said that has to be eliminated. I don't know how they're going to achieve that. But the good news for Ukraine is Russia's willing to stop this war and give Ukraine, for instance, the city of Odessa. That allows Ukraine continued access to the Black Sea, which means Ukraine can survive as a modern nation state. They can have Dnipropetrovsk, a major industrial facility that gives Ukraine an industrial heartland. They can have Kharkov, again, another industrial city. But if Ukraine continues this fight at the behest of NATO, which we see the United States and NATO urging Ukraine to continue, Russia will take those 3 cities, and those 3 cities will become Russian. That's just a reality that means the virtual death of the Ukrainian nation as we now know it.